In 1940, while German bombs were falling over London and Britain was fighting for its life, something far quieter and far more devastating was happening across the Atlantic. Winston Churchill picked up a pen, signed a document he swore he'd never sign, and unknowingly triggered the downfall of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. It wasn't a battlefield defeat. It wasn't a lost naval engagement. It was a loan agreement, dressed up as aid, wrapped in friendly language, and celebrated as a lifeline. But what Britain didn't realize was that every dollar it accepted came with a hidden cost, one that would drain its gold, strip its assets, and leave the empire financially paralyzed long after the war was won. Most people know the story of World War II. They know the battles, the speeches, the heroism, but almost no one knows the financial war happening behind the scenes, a war in which the United States quietly outmaneuvered its closest ally and emerged as the new global superpower. And when the final payment was made in 2006, yes, 2006, the true scale of what had happened finally became impossible to ignore. But what exactly did America do? How did a nation fighting for freedom manage to bankrupt the very empire it was helping? And what did Churchill realize far too late about the deal he had signed? The answers reveal a story darker, colder, and far more calculated than the textbooks ever mention. And once you see how this financial trap worked, you'll recognize the same pattern being used again today, quietly, strategically, and with consequences that will echo for decades. What happened next is something you'll want to understand in full. So stick with me till the end, and if you want more hidden economic history that reshaped the world, make sure you subscribe. December 31st, 2006, a quiet winter morning in London. Most people were preparing for New Year celebrations, but inside the British Treasury, something far more historic was happening. A single wire transfer, just $83 million, left Britain's accounts and traveled across the Atlantic to the United States. No fireworks, no ceremony, no headlines. Yet that moment closed one of the most extraordinary financial chapters in world history. Britain had finally finished paying for World War II, 61 years after victory. 61 years after Churchill declared the empire would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, and never surrender. 3 generations of British families had been silently paying for a war, most of them weren't even alive to witness. And the payment wasn't for winning, it was for continuing. It was the price America charged Britain for the right to stay in the fight. But the final payment was only the epilogue. The real story begins much earlier, long before Pearl Harbor, long before D-Day. At a moment when the world's most powerful empire suddenly found itself drowning in a sea of math it could not escape. In 1939, Britain entered World War II as the world's richest empire, a quarter of the world's land, a currency trusted everywhere, and the world's largest net creditor. London was the financial capital of the planet. If you were a government needing money, you went to London. If you traded goods, you priced them in pounds. If you wanted stability, you relied on the British Empire. But war consumes wealth like fire consumes oxygen. And by December 1939, Britain was burning through its gold and dollars at a shocking pace. Shipping fees, food imports, oil, steel, aircraft, everything had to be bought abroad, and everything had to be paid for in dollars. The pound was still the pound, but it wasn't enough. Wars aren't fought with prestige, they're fought with hard currency. By late 1940, Britain was nearly bankrupt. Not collapsing bankrupt. Churchill knew it. The British Treasury knew it. Even Hitler knew it. Britain simply didn't have the money to keep fighting. They were running out of gold, out of reserves, and out of time. And that's when President Franklin Roosevelt stepped in. Not with charity, not with alliance, but with a contract, Lend-Lease. Today, it's remembered as a heroic gesture, a selfless effort by America to support democracy in its darkest hour. But history becomes mythology when people stop reading the fine print. And the fine print of Lend-Lease was the most expensive document Britain ever signed. Roosevelt told Churchill, "Don't worry about paying now. We'll work out the costs after the war." And on the surface, that sounded merciful. Britain could acquire weapons, tanks, planes, food, and oil without sending money up front. They could survive. They could fight another day. But the condition was ruthless. To receive aid, Britain had to liquidate its overseas investments, everything from Canadian railroads to South African mines, from Indian bonds to Australian enterprises. Generations of British wealth, accumulated over a century, were sold off at fire sale prices to American buyers. The U.S. Treasury insisted on it. Britain could not receive Lend-Lease until it had sold its foreign assets down to the last dollar. In one stroke, Britain lost the financial engine that powered its global empire. Then came the bases. The U.S. demanded access to Bermuda, Newfoundland, the Caribbean 99-year leases, strategic locations transformed into American assets. Britain agreed, because the alternative was national collapse. And while all this was happening, the U.S. Treasury kept a detailed account of every item sent: ammunition, crates, aircraft engines, medical equipment, food rations, even ball bearings. Every piece was logged. Every dollar was added to Britain's growing tab. By 1943, the British Empire had been financially gutted. By 1945, it was financially finished. Then, just 7 days after Japan surrendered in 1945, President Truman ended Lend-Lease with no warning. British supply ships in the Atlantic were literally turned back mid-voyage because they could no longer be funded. Britain suddenly faced a financial cliff edge. So in 1946, desperate to keep its economy from collapsing, Britain signed the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, the deal that would take 61 years to repay. The interest rate? It's %. Sounds harmless until you realize the loan was enormous. $31 billion in wartime aid became the equivalent of $486 billion in today's money. But the money wasn't the real cost. The real cost was the empire itself. The British Empire had survived the Blitz, U-boats, and Hitler, but it could not survive the math. The United States had become the world's largest creditor. Britain had become its largest debtor. And debtors don't dictate global systems. Between 1947 and 1960, one colony after another gained independence. India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Jordan, Israel, Sudan, Malaysia, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya. The empire cracked apart. The pound lost its reserve status. London lost its financial dominance. America hadn't conquered the British Empire. It had financed it into submission. Was this malicious? Opportunistic? Strategic? Some historians argue the U.S. saved Britain and simply demanded fair accounting. Others argue it was the greatest non-military power shift in history, an empire traded for survival. But the truth is simpler and colder. Global power belongs to whoever controls global credit. Debt destroys empires more cleanly than war. And what happened to Britain during and after World War II didn't teach us reshape the 20th century? It created a blueprint the United States has used repeatedly. Provide loans in crisis, demand asset liquidation, secure strategic footholds, and allow interest to compound until power shifts silently. It happened to Latin America in the 1980s. It happened to Russia in the 1990s. It happened to Europe during the Eurozone crisis. And today, many nations argue it's happening to them. The British Empire's fall wasn't caused by Germany. It wasn't caused by bombs. It wasn't caused by battles. It was caused by arithmetic, the kind that moves quietly, invisibly, and relentlessly. When Britain made that final $83 million payment in 2006, commentators called it a symbolic closure. But if you really understand the numbers, it wasn't closure at all. It was confirmation of a truth nations still struggle with today. Wars end on the battlefield. But empires end on the balance sheet.